Uh, Hello and good morning, everyone. Good morning as well to our participants online and here with us at the Smart Classroom here at the Faculty of Political Science of Chulalongkorn University. So, yeah, welcome to our online Zoom room and welcome to our participants here in person, mostly, of course, from our International Development Studies program here. So, on behalf of the MAIDS-GRID program here at the Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University, it's my pleasure to open the third session in our expert research seminar series, which is an initiative run by our GRID PhD students to bring scholars from across the field of development studies into conversation with us. So today's session sits very close to the heart of what we do here. For much of its history, public policy in Asia has been studied through the frameworks that prize technical expertise, rational models, and a certain confidence that good data leads to good decisions. So those approaches have given us a great deal, but they've also often struggled to account for the political complexity, the inequality, and the contested nature of governance that define so much of the region. So the title of today's seminar is Doing Policy Otherwise, Critical Policy Studies and the Interpretive Turn in Asia. At its core, this talk asks two questions. First, how do we decide what even counts as a policy problem? And second, and perhaps more urgently, whose knowledge and whose experiences get to count when we govern? So, to guide us through these queries, we are very fortunate to welcome Dr. Noe John, Sacramento. So, welcome, Dr. John. So, Dr. Sacramento, to introduce Dr. Sacramento. So, Dr. Dr. Sacramento is an assistant professor of public policy and political science at the University of the Philippines, Cebu. He is also a non-resident adjunct faculty at the School of Public Policy in Chiang Mai University here in Thailand. John has done research on deliberative policy analysis, the technical and participatory nexus in smart city planning, informality and emotionality in deliberation, as well as the critical pragmatist logic in policy analysis in high inequalities. He is also interested in developments of critical policy studies in Asia, the interpretive and constructivist turn in public policy across the region, and how policy knowledge is contested and challenged in the face of power. His recent book with Routledge, just published, I think, in 2026, just this year, is on policy analysis in high inequalities in Asia, critical and pragmatic perspectives, co-authored with Ajahn Piapong Busabong and Upsok Chamchong, from Chiang Mai University. So a quick word on the flow of our talk before we begin. So Dr. Sacramento will speak for the first part of our session, so that's about an hour. We will then open the floor for a discussion and Q&A from our audience in person and online. For those of you who will be joining online, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat as they come to you, or feel free to raise your hand as well. Yeah, since we are having a hybrid session this morning. So, Dr. Sacramento, the floor is yours, and please join me in welcoming him.
Okay, thank you so much, Ryan. Uh, so I'd like to thank first Carl Middleton, for inviting me today to speak before you about this very, I would say, interesting, interesting topic on policy or critical policy studies. Well, public policy, I would say, is still growing as a discipline in Southeast Asia or perhaps in Asia. We know that there has been schools in public policy in Singapore, for example, like the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and among other public policy schools in East Asia, Hong Kong, and in Japan. And we also wanted to acknowledge that in public policy, there has been different epistemologies as well as ontologies, ways of knowing on what are the policy knowledge that exists, or what are the policy knowledge that has been talked about in perhaps in the practice and in theory building in public policy. So perhaps I would like to start with a little bit of history as to how and why critical policy studies emerged as some sort of a branch or a critique to policy science in the field of public policy. And at the same time, perhaps bring some perspectives from scholars who's been doing lots of work in critical policy studies, as well as in interpretive policy analysis, where it, developed as a field in interpretive policy analysis. And maybe later in my discussion, I'd like to highlight how critical policy studies and the interpretivist perspective emerge in Asia. And why is it important, and why is it like a necessary complement to the existing and dominant policy science perspective? So when I ask someone, how do you define public policy, or what public policy is about in your very layman perspective or layman definition? Most would refer to legislation, or most would refer to policy formulation, guidelines, laws, what to do and what not to do, what government action is all about, and what non-action is all about. And mostly we refer public policy as linked to certain technical tools. Like for example, we refer them to cost-benefit analysis. We refer them to EIA, environmental impact assessment. We also refer them to what else? There are a lot of things like talking to engineers, to scientists, and so on. But what I'm bringing here today is an alternative perspective to that. And this is very influenced by some European Frankfurt school, I would say, from Germany, and coming from that kind of critical theory or interpretive perspective. I'll try my best to give some or share something that is quite friendly to everyone, and we will not like experience an information overload or theory overload out of this discussion. Now, again, my name is John. I'm from the Philippines. I teach political science and public policy at the University of the Philippines, Cebu. And at the same time, I occasionally come here to Thailand to engage at Chiang Mai University School of Public Policy in Northern Thailand, in Chiang. Okay, so let me start with a brief introduction or discussion about policy science. And I don't know how to. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, policy science. Well, we cannot dismiss the fact that public policy or policy science, as they refer to in the earlier development of the field, is highly related or relevant to political science. And of course, Harold Laswell is, some of the founding fathers of public policy or policy science. Policy science emerged in the mid-20th century after the World Wars as a deliberate attempt to bring systematic rational knowledge and to bear on public problems. And Harold Laswell have written what he called as policy science for democracy in response to the World War, a field that would integrate social science expertise with democratic governance to solve the pressing problems of the age or of the society at the time. Well, the purpose and objective or goal of Harold Laswell is really, science for democracy. We need a systematic approach, perspective to democracy. How we will govern aftermath of the wars, where we have to rebuild again, and so on. And these problems, this crisis, we call it policy issues or policy problems. And the way they understand it is that for us to address these issues after the wars, we need to tap engineers, scientists, doctors, and so on, because they have a certain level of expertise to address these policy issues. So that's how policy science was brought into picture. Of course, some of the features of scientific aspiration would, has been proven, science has been proven productive in knowledge generation and cost effective rather than any other social activity. Ideally, we see science as universalism, communality, we avoid personal stake or biases, and we require empirical and logical evidence for claims. And this is where policy science used to operate. They operate from the assumption that we need a systematic or scientific system, highly tailored, coming from a scientific standpoint, scientific perspective. But scientific facts and truths are in any case temporary and provisional, representing only the current consensus, sometimes very long-lived, within a community of researchers. So regardless of this kind of aspiration, regardless of how Harold Laswell would point that science can address policy issues of the time and science as a tool to democracy, but then again, there are certain challenges in this kind of scientific approach. And these challenges cannot be addressed with another kind of scientific framing, but rather this has later been argued by scholars coming from interpretive perspective that we might need to rethink how we utilize the scientific approach to addressing policy issues of our time. Well, I will go into that discussion later in the presentation. Now, going a little back to the earlier discussion, policy science have grown or has been established out of the crisis of the time. Emerged in the 20th century, it's a deliberate attempt to bring scientific and rational knowledge to bear on public problems. And the field grew from a specific historical moment, the devastation of the two world wars, the economic crisis of the Great Depression, and the ideological competition of the Cold War. And of course, in policy science, we cannot take away the concept of technocracy. They promise technocracy. The promise of technocracy is indeed to provide rational, technical, expert-driven solutions or expert-driven perspectives to planning the economy, managing welfare states, and navigating geographical threats. Policy analysis, which is a very important element of public policy, became that tool. Technocracy has become a tool for policy analysis, where technology of governance provide a promising method that needs to be applied to certain problem that could produce the right solution. Like for example, they would have this kind of bounded kind of rationality model. They operate from a perspective that only experts and scientists can provide solution to problems in the society. They only taught engineers at the time to address, of course, the problems of the war. And the role of analysts are, these are elite group of people who address policy issues of the time. Analyst was cast as neutral expert and above politics, above ideology, and above the messiness of power. So basically, policy science operate from those kinds of assumptions. We need to operate in a certain neutral ground, value-free, in order to address policy issues. But, of course, we need to deal with caution. This is particularly in the context of policy science vis-a-vis what we call now as public policy. Science may fall as an elite enterprise that systematically excludes or marginalizes incompetent practitioners, and that's what they say. They describe practitioners as competent because they don't bear that kind of scientific knowledge. I don't want to be called as an expert, but I'm just a scholar. I'm interested in these kinds of things. But of course, the expertise, the concept in itself is also, debated. How do we position experts in society? How do we position experts in addressing policy issues? So this is what they caution us when we think of policy science at the time, as they applied kind of scientific thinking, assumption, and elite positioning in society. Democracy as the best form, well, the tendency is that only tiny segments of society produces, communicates, and advocates on behalf of the scientific knowledge. That's some of the criticism of, some other scholars at the time. If we operate within the assumption of policy science, then perhaps we do not necessarily represent everyone in the society, or we do not necessarily represent the marginalized voices in society. Like, for example, the lay people, the ordinary people, who, at the very least, or at the end of the day, are the ones who are experiencing the difficulties or the problems, the pressing problems of the society. Other sources of relevant elite-based knowledge, the legal expertise of attorneys, the moral authorities of religious leaders, and the sharp pencils of accountants, and the contribution of many types of professionals all contribute to the better public decision making. Now, this criticism brings us to the idea, do we now entertain the plurality of knowledge, the plurality of skills and expertise? We do not only appreciate certain scientific kind of knowledge coming from doctors, coming from scientists, but at the end of the day, public policy would always open a room to understand and to look into the different forms of knowledge coming from lay people or those people who are working on the ground, the street bureaucrats. Now, this is where CPS emerge, or critical policy studies emerge, as a critique to policy science. Policy is never just technical, it is always also political. And this is what they argue. Before we move to this discussion on critical policy studies, I would say that in Asia, particularly, those countries that were colonized by the Western world at the time, we always, like for example, the Philippines, we always follow the American framework of governance, right? And whatever has been developed at the time, for example, the development of policy science in the 1960s has also carried over to the Philippines and influenced the frameworks of public administration and governance. And even public policy did not emerge as its own field in the country. In Thailand, for example, if you look into the book on policy analysis in Thailand, they even attributed the development of governance and public administration from the influence of the Brits, the United Kingdom, and because of King Chulalongkorn V, right, Rama V, he brought those learnings coming from the West, from Europe, to establish here in Chulalongkorn. That's why you have Chulalongkorn University as the university or the institution for civil servants. So this is like the brief history of how public administration, how this disciplines has been brought into the Asian context, or perhaps in Thailand and the Philippines, as far as I know. And it did not really emerge on its own, like, it was founded here, or emerged here in our own, in Asia, but rather this was brought into the Asian context. And it's very important, or perhaps interesting, to really dig deeper on how this influences, has been has been operated here, and perhaps was how it has been operationalized by scholars and practitioners within the region. And I would also want to point it out later in the discussion, right? How these perspectives coming from policy science and critical policy studies has been hybridized by scholars in Southeast Asia, in respect to the context sensitivity that we always hold. Okay, so CPS emerged as a critique to policy science. From the 1970s onward, a growing body of scholarship exposed what mainstream policy analysis consistently obscured. The technocratic promise rested on a false neutrality, one that tended to silence those least able to contest it. So, early scholarship that criticized policy science is that of Machon, evidence, arguments, persuasion in the policy process, as well as Frank Fisher's work on citizens expert and the environment, and the argumentative turn in policy analysis and planning, which was also a foundational work towards the development of what we call as critical policy studies today. The contentions of these authors or scholars is that we cannot divorce politics, power, and democracy within talks of these policy issues for time. And at the same time, there's no such thing as value neutrality or being value free in addressing policy issues or thinking about policy alternatives and solutions. And this is the main or perhaps the basic arguments of these people, which Succeeding critical policy scholars have also built on their shoulders. Uh, we also they also wanted to understand and appreciate the value of discourses, the value of argumentation, in thinking about policy problems and policy alternatives to address these issues or policy problems. They also wanted to understand where experts are coming from. And does expert knowledge really matter all the time in addressing policy issues? And also understand the perspective of the lay people in understanding these policy issues. Okay. Now, the contestations and criticisms of conventional policy analysis as what works. This assumes goals are settled, problems are correctly named, and analysts find the most efficient path to solution. Critical policy studies ask instead, works for whom, decides by whom, and on whose terms. And these are not supplementary, they are prior questions that should exist. So when we address policy issues, it's not just like asking what really works at the moment, and we just need to address it. Policy scholars coming from critical and interpretive perspective would always ask, where do we situate, or where do we situate the public within understanding certain policy issue? Why are we working on this? And who are the main beneficiaries of these solutions that we're working on, or alternatives that we're working on? What this reveals is that the power is a disguise. Every policy choices distributes benefit and burdens unevenly. Problem definitions are themselves act of power. So one of the most popular books or works on policy analysis would always lead us to the work of William Dunn. However, William Dunn have always accounted technical tools or technocratic perspective towards understanding policy issues. In the book of Dunn, Dunn would always suggest that when we think about policy problems, there will always be a solution to that. And we need to follow certain frameworks or framing in order to address these policy issues. Alternatively, works like that of John Forrester would perhaps socially capitalize on, not for the lack of better term, capitalize on the role of facilitators. In the mainstream conventional policy analysis, they would always see analysts as neutral facilitators or neutral analysts who hold this knowledge, and we just need to make the modeling. We just need to make the frameworks and so on, apply whatever data that we have, and then we got a solution. But for critical policy scholars, interpretive scholars, they see practitioners as deliberative facilitators. Facilitators who has this perhaps role and objective, not just to facilitate, but to also advocate in addressing certain policy issues. They also see deliberative practitioners as activists, engaging in policy issues that impacts the community. Deliberative practitioners are not classified as a value neutral. They are classified perhaps as an active agent in the process of doing policy analysis. Okay. Now, let's go back a little bit to the definition of public policy. Perhaps if we go back to Wildowski, and as early as, I forgot his name, Grisek? Oh no, Grisek, right? Grisek. It would always, John Grisek. It would always link, or we will always define public policy as what the government does and the effects on the citizen. But we do not only conform to that kind of linear definition of what public policy is. Sometimes what the government do for the people beyond citizens, we don't limit citizens of a country or citizens of a state alone, but to people in general, coming from, from the outside. So what the government choose to do or not to do. So even not doing anything is public policy as well. Inaction is also public policy. To the public and to the, like for example, visitors, to tourists and digital nomads. I think one specific example is the reduction of the visa, you know? The tourist visa from 30 days to 6 days. In action, like for example, the legalization of cannabis, there is a move to criminalize it again or not to legalize cannabis anymore. But the government choose not to act on it at the moment. And that's public policy as well. Choosing not to act on certain policy issues is also public policy. We can also include individuals or group act in the name of the state. We can talk more about that if the mic is off. uh, Act in the name of state or act in the name of institutions, influencing as if they were public sector actors. And we tried to investigate this part in the context of Thailand. How do we understand a decolonial perspective to the epistemology of policy studies uh, from the context of Thailand? And we try to map it out, coming from that Thainess thing, if you can remember in your previous lecture. So we also include them, the individuals or groups. So it's not only limited to governments alone. So this is where we operate in an alternative perspective to public policy. So public policy is not limited to government, but it's also towards the groups, towards these marginalized groups or people's organization or a certain sector, regardless if they are pro-state or not towards or not supportive of the state and so on, towards humanity and even the earth. So you get to have policy scholars who talks about the agency of the nature, the right to nature. I think you're familiar with that as well. And also post-human understanding, post-human, more than human understanding, or more than human theories and so on. They're also involved in public policy. So public policy is the mode of social expression of public concerns and expected solution. That's how Busabong would put it. Okay. So public policy from a post-positivist lens go beyond the technical framing, the technocratic framing. The first serious challenge to technocratic promise did not come from outside, it came from within the philosophy of science itself. Post-positivism unsettled the claim that scientific knowledge is neutral, cumulative, and objective. The post-positivist approach or perspective positions that there's no such thing as neutral, or there's no such thing as purely objective. For policy studies, the implications were uncomfortable. If the methods of natural science could not be straightforwardly transplanted into social and political life, then the analyst authority was on the shaky ground. This was not just a methodological problem, it was a deeper epistemological one about what kind of knowledge policy analysis actually produce and whose interests that knowledge tends to serve. So it brings us from a post-positivist lens, it brings us to an understanding that there's no such thing as on a single form of policy knowledge. We do policy analysis not for a single form of policy knowledge. We do policy analysis because we understand and believe that there are different kinds or different forms of knowledge. And subjectivity matters here. CPS and the several terms. So from policy science to the critical policy studies that we know right now also experience several terms that resonates or that help build what critical policy studies is about. First is the interpretive turn. The post-positivism opens space for interpretivism. And scholars have begun arguing that policy problems are not just there waiting to be diagnosed. This is the usual technical perspective that there's a policy issue there, and we bring in experts and we diagnose them. Just like when you're sick, right? You go to the hospital, you get diagnosed, you get medicine. But critical policy studies, interpretivism would see it differently. Scholars, they are constructed, shaped by language, by narratives, and the frames through which different actors make sense of the world. So we don't see public policy as a mere input and output kind of, you know, construction, but rather it's more cyclical, spiral. It's not linear. No, we see that at some points we may start identifying the problem and then addressing it and giving a solution. But then again, there are some instances that we see the solution first and then diagnose and see what problem is within that solution and try to understand it from a more complex kind of perspective. Hermeneutics, phenomenology, and symbolic interactionisms are part of the early interpretivist work. And early scholar on interpretivism, interpretive policy analysis, is that of Yano's work on interpretation, that it shows that policies carry cultural meanings that vary across communities, meanings that technical analysts tend to miss entirely. And this is what we argue all the time, that when we think of policy issues and addressing them in contexts such as in Asia, we cannot just simply get rid of the meanings or forget about the meanings and cultural meanings, as they say, in addressing these policy issues. Like, for example, the issue of opium in the northern Thailand, I think you went for a field trip tour, right? In the Tak district. Some of you. I'm not all sorry. I used to study a lot of things. So in the opium, you cannot just simply deal with the opium addiction or the opium crisis in the northern Thailand from a linear perspective. But it's more like layered. There are cultural aspect of it that needs to be unpacked. There are also social and economic aspect that push people to use opium. So, and I think I had the chance to go to the area in the TAP district, near the border, where the opium crisis is really happening, and see some of those who were addicted before still suffering from the impacts or effects of addiction. So there are a very important consideration why we need cultural meanings to consider in addressing or thinking about policy issues. The second turn is about the argumentative turn, and this is most closely related to Fisher and Forrester's 1993 volume that gives critical spirit its sharpest formulation. The core argument here, which is what they say is consequential, policy analysis is fundamentally a practice of argumentation and not calculation. We argue, we engage in discussion. Arguments is a fundamental element in doing policy analysis. And we do not just simply calculate, because if we bring the perspective coming from Deborah Stone on counting, Deborah would rather argue that counting in itself is not the end of understanding policy issues, but rather we can therefore further unfold meanings from the numbers that we see from the charts and so on. So Fisher and Forrester puts here that analysts do not simply find facts and present them. They frame problems, select evidence, and appeal to values and persuade audiences. Fisher's later work on reframing public policy pushed further, showing how policy discourses shape what problems become visible, what solutions become thinkable, and whose voices get heard. The analyst is not a neutral technician. He or she is a participant in the political argument. That's what it's been saying. That the policy analyst, or perhaps using the word of John Forrester, the deliberative practitioner or the policy practitioner is an active participant of the policy process. And he or she engages in policy argumentation or perhaps advocacy and activism. So whether you acknowledge it or not. So some of the policy practitioners are not conscious that they're already engaging in that kind of argument. and an active participation in the policy process. So that's why Fisher positioned, the reframing of public policy is more engaged in the discursive politics, deliberation of the deliberative practices. This also linked to the second one, the third one, on deliberative policy analysis. Perhaps the discussion of Frank Fisher on argumentative turn in policy analysis would better inform the rise or the the foundations of deliberative policy analysis coming from the Frankfurt School of Thought, drawing from heavily on Habermas and the Frankfurt School. Argumentation alone is, well, there's a question. How can you make argumentation valid in the face of, understanding policy issues or bringing empirics into the discussion and into the discussion of the policy issues and later in the crafting of alternatives. Now, this is where deliberative policies analysis came in. Because argumentation alone does not constitute, or perhaps others would argue that does not constitute some empirical evidence to put into the table for discussion of policy issues. Deliberative policy analysis offers what they call as Habermas theory of communicative action. Legitimate policy discourses requires condition of free, open, and undistorted kind of communication. Scholars like Hayel and Water, among many, developed this into a deliberative policy analysis that called for an inclusive, participatory, and reflexive policy process. For deliberative policy analysis, they have three pillars. Of course, interpretation is part of it, since DPA is also influenced by interpretive approach to policy analysis. The second one is practice. Practice where they wanted to include different actors from the ground, like street level bureaucrats, lay people to engage in deliberation. Some scholars would argue that, you call them as mini publics. If you go to deliberative democracy theories and so on, you call it mini publics. And the third one is deliberation in itself, the act in itself. So engaging in a deliberative process with all these actors and engaging in an interpretive style of policy analysis brings us to certain rethinking of policy issues. But my only single critique about this approach is that it's very messy, especially in the Asian context. In Europe, where it came from, you can bring people in a town hall meeting, right? People can join and so on. And I think the authors, Hendrik, personally Hendrik, would position this perspective for deliberative policy analysis. Like, everyone gets to participate, we invite everyone, and we expect them to show up. But in Asian context, it's really difficult to have people show up in a deliberative forum. So what is the alternative, therefore, for this approach? While we understand the benefits of the principles that is embedded in deliberative policy analysis, we also need to consider context sensitivity in the process of doing policy analysis or deliberative policy analysis. So, apart from doing it in a formal forum, perhaps we might need to think about informality in deliberation. So, this is my suggestion to the work of them, these two scholars, that we need to rethink how deliberative policy analysis work or deliberative practice work in a highly unequal context. And that is through informal spaces, opening informal spaces for deliberation, which I will try to speak more about that in the later slides. And then another turn is on pragmatism. This is best explained as an approach rather than starting from normative ideals, looks at actors themselves to justify action and contests others through different registers of value and legitimacy. And this is highly linked to Zeton's work on pragmatism to describe how policy actors think, act and survive in chaotic world of politics. I think the highly, well, the two perspectives, the other one is that of Forrester on critical pragmatism. This one is heavily rooted in democratic ethics and power dynamics. Actors should actively work to equalize power, challenge misinformation, and bring marginalized voices to the table. Well, the two have different perspectives to what they call as pragmatism. While Chiton is highly inclined towards understanding how policy actors would survive in a certain forum or a certain arena. Well, Forrester would always touch upon actors as an active agent in democratizing and equalizing the voices and pushing for active role of policy actors or practitioners in the process. But I think these two, though perhaps different, are still relevant in the development of critical policy studies. Their work has, several merits, I would say, that inform succeeding works on critical policy studies. And Sitton's and Forrester work are, useful on how we conceptualize and understand critical policy studies in Asia. Other turns or other perspectives to critical policy studies includes emotion and affect, democratizing CPS, feminist and gender lenses, and post-colonial and decolonial perspectives. Okay, so basically in a nutshell, this is how picture it out. Critical policy studies as a discourse, power, and contestation. The shared commitments among these scholars and among these works includes anti-positivism, constructivism, and power-sensitive analysis. CPS includes an argumentative third, interpretation, Habermasian hermeneutics, and the Frankfurt School's perspective and of course, to highlight communicative rationality, and technocracy as domination, pragmatism, and some other alternative routes like emotions, bodies, and post-colonialism that is important aspects or elements of critical policy studies as well. So in a nutshell, CPS commits to first epistemological critique, exposing how policy problems are framed and what is silence. And of course, democratic reopening. We still engage or we still establish democracy is still an important element, important factor, amplifying marginalized voices and counter narratives. Okay, so how did this whole thing influence Asia? CPS has no single core network in its plural overlapping constellation of epistemic communities. And network share, as I mentioned earlier, is anti-positivist commitment, but differ in ideology, normative orientation, and degree of institutionalization. This network functions as a normative connective platform, not primarily as a resource or career structure. And coexisting and interacting networks are the lifeboat of field against instrumental technocratic dominance. So let's try to map out a little bit CPS in Asia. Well, the Asian CPS network traces back in 2016 with the first Critical Policy Studies Asia panel in the Interpretive Policy Analysis Conference in the UK. And it grew through ICPP panel, or the International Conference for Public Policy, panels in Singapore, and recently in Toronto, and here in Thailand in 2025. A formal roster of Asian CPS scholars was built from CPS Journal, and Asian scholars now contributing to critical research and so on. Policy research, I just want to highlight that policy research in Asia faces pressure to serve techno-rationalist top-down kind of system, which is the reality that we have here. Making a critical stance both more necessary and more institutionally precarious. And standing here right now is a precarious moment because no one will, well, thanks to Carl for entertaining my ideas about CPS or interpretive policy analysis. But if you put this into the bigger scale of things, then some scholars would raise some eyebrows, especially those who coming from a technical background in understanding public policy. But then again, critical policy studies has been a growing field, and it's been an established field in the public policy discipline. So the key scholars of CPS in Asia includes Yali from China. Yali has been working on deliberative policy analysis and bringing it into the Chinese context. As I mentioned earlier, deliberative policy analysis has three pillars, right? Interpretation, practice, and deliberation. And these three principles or these three pillars always bring in the concept of democracy or democratic participation of the public. But then again, Yali's argument is that policy analysis or DPA, deliberative policy analysis in Chinese authoritarian context, it can be adopted, perhaps in highly authoritarian contexts. However, it raises hard question about deliberation act. What deliberation actually means when the party remains the final decision. And I think this is well shared as well in Thailand context, where decisions are made in the central government, in the parliament, where you have strong institutions and strong structures. But then again, some Thai scholars would argue that deliberative policy analysis can be better implemented in the local context, where participation is more stronger, where citizens can get to involve, regardless of highly central kind of dynamics in Thailand. On the other hand, we have Hemant as well, who shows how techno-bureaucratic doxa persists even after participatory reforms, using critical action research to challenge hegemonic powers in environmental governance from the ground up. Piapong has pushed for CPS towards an empathetic policy process, the role of emotions, the role of empathy, arguing that policy must be emotionally responsive to hope and fears. So Piapong tries to work around the hopes of people and the fears of people and identifying policy issues and solutions with a mix of technical tools a little bit, and at the same time, deliberative policy analysis and the role of some causal layered analysis in this work. Navdeep Mathur exposes how neoliberal urban governance produces fantasy imaginaries that erase the lived realities of those most affected by policy, bringing interpretive and critical framework to bear on India's deep structural inequalities. So this is where we see that, interpretation also holds a very significant element or significant role in understanding this kind of fantasy imaginaries. What the government feeds its people to imagine, Singapore like Cebu, right? With Melbourne features or something like that. These kinds of narratives are very rich, and it's up for us as policy analysts, for example, to unpack the meanings and the interpretation out of these kinds of things. So this just like with India. Now, scholarship and key topics on CPS in Asia includes still links back to technocracy and how inequalities, how these are mutually reinforcing, and also the goal of bringing back the public in the discussion. The Western CPS assumes democracy and civil society as default, perhaps. Now, Asia often has neither or lack of, making critique more urgent but requiring different tools. The key concerns includes like climate governance, urban inequality, social justice, deliberation under authoritarian and semi-democratic conditions. And Asian policy knowledge is historically embedded. Like we also adhere to certain logics from our religion, the Buddhist logics or teachings, for example. We also take hold of certain colonial legacies as we make decisions, right? Like, for example, why the Philippines does not have same-sex marriage up until now, or perhaps divorce, because of certain colonial legacies, religious, whatever. And post-colonial state building also matter. The frontier here is that we wanted to push for an epistemic emancipation, expanding what is politically imaginable even within the constraints or constrained environment. What we actually mean by epistemic emancipation is that for us to understand the policy issue or the problem holistically, we need to appreciate that there are different forms of knowledge. And by that, we need to also appreciate that there are different forms or ways of knowing. There are different forms of epistemology. Okay. So CPS in Asia and the Asian policy styles, we have recommended or highlighted here that policy styles and norms are politically and bureaucratically constructed meanings of what good policy looks like in each of our contexts, perhaps in Asian context. And in this book, in the chapter, we highlighted 5 dominant styles. First, the developmental state. The second one is spirituality and human centrism. This is very relevant to Southeast Asian context and South Asian context. Communitarianism, sufficiency and self-reliance. If you have, I think you've encountered in several discussions that sufficiency, economy, okay, yeah, and the philosophy, right? And self-reliance, and of course, you cannot get rid of it, technological solutionism. We have also shared critical features. They depolitize development. And this is how I think this is where it links to development studies. Too much technological solutionism would also lead to like depoliticizing uh, depoliticizing what was it again? Development. They do not challenge existing power, ignore social structural transformation, or obstruct democratization. In the name of community and self-reliance, the burden of survival is placed on the poor rather than on the state to address structural inequality. Technological solutionism marginalizes deliberation and participation, while introducing new forms of surveillance and control under the guise of smart governance. Um, it's ironic, right? I'm doing smart city planning, but certain criticisms are put into smart governance. Well, that smart city planning thing, we argued differently there that in doing smart cities or smart city planning, it does not necessarily need to follow the highly technological solutions logic coming from the foundational works by scholars who work on the smart cities and so on. But rather, we need to somehow adjust a little bit according to how people would imagine a smart city for their own or for themselves. So when we think about smart city, we need technologies and so on. But for the people, in the case that we're working on, they said that no, we don't see it that way, but rather we see it as more of a circular kind of economy. Meaning to say it's not just technology at the center of it, but rather people engaging in a circular kind of economy. So smart city planning, we argue that it would be best operate if we start with a more of a argumentative and deliberative kind of discussion. How does the people imagine a smart city for themselves? What do they think about the benefits of a smart city? And from there, we can build on those kinds of discussions, perspectives from the people, um, in thinking about what kind of innovation we can bring in to a smart city, to their smart city. So yeah, you know, these are some of the styles that we need to do as well. These styles are not neutral, they legitimate elite power, maintain hierarchical societies, and keep citizens from seeing systematic injustice. So technocracy is a recurring tension here in Asia. Why a purely technical approach won't always work, at the very least, from an Asian experience. Authoritarian regimes actively weaponize technocracy to consolidate power and legitimize elite control. And technocracy and inequality are mutually reinforcing. Expertise excludes lay knowledge, inequality entrenches expert dominance. We do not reject technocracy outright. We reject its dominance. In crisis, for example, expert knowledge still matter. Of course, we cannot track the typhoon, but we need tools to track the typhoon. But then again, with response to the disaster, to a certain crisis, we need certain practical solutions right in place put there. You know, how do we deal with a flood right now in a certain community? And so the goal is that we need to reimagine the public in public policy. and emancipate policy knowledge from an elite capture. An elite capture has been there for so long. When we think about, or when people talk about foreign policy, it's always coming from an elite narrative. But then again, we need to resituate public and public policy. And that's the role of interpretivism and critical perspective to public policy or policy knowledge. And why a purely, okay, something like critical approach needs a supplementary framework? There should be an alternative at some point. Fisher's critical policy inquiry does not reject technical analysis. It refuses to let it be the only valid form of policy knowledge. I think he will kill me for this person. I don't know. He sometimes he would say that we need to appreciate technical analysis, technical tools. I think it should be put it that way, technical tools. But Fisher is really firm in his position that public policy should not be treated from a technical standpoint. Technical policy analysis exists and has merits, and Fisher's contribution is to insist it is always already political, embedded in values, power, and framing choices. What Fisher opens up is the interpretive potential of policy analysis. Meanings, narratives, and the voices that rational technical frameworks routinely suppresses or do not appreciate. This is not anti-expertise kind of thing. It is a demand for epistemic humility about what expertise can and cannot see. And sometimes we need to also understand that meanings are also important in societies such as here in Thailand. And also narratives of the people are also important because sometimes this lay people or ordinary public narrative would better frame the solution or the alternative to a certain policy issue. Fisher thus gives us both a critique and alternative direction, deliberative, argumentative, and participatory modes of inquiry that sit alongside and not replace tools. So linking back to Asia, there is more to public policy analysis than technical rationality. The question for Asia is, what does the surplus look like? In the context of authoritarianism and deep inequality and fragile democratic institutions, the interpretive potential Fisher's open is not a luxury, it is a political necessity. And we need that interpretive potential, especially when we speak to power. When we speak to those people in power. And when we speak to those people on the ground as well. This is where critical policy studies in Asia enter. Not simply applying Fisher, but adapting and extending his insight to conditions he did not fully theorize. He did not fully, actualize because the context that he is in could also matter to how the perspectives and the writings were done in his theory. The alternative direction is negotiated from within Asian political and epistemic realities. So we wanted to put highlight on plurality in practice here in critical policy studies in Asia. Policy knowledge spans from everyday practices. Like for example, the voices of ordinary citizens' knowledge, the activities and lay voices from policy understanding, not expert-led. You can see in a very, we always like highlight this as a method in critical policy studies. We call it interpretive policy research. We call it policy ethnography. You go and listen to the voices of those people in the market. Observe the the daily interactions of those people. You can see the dynamics, the political dynamics, how ordinary people or lay people would influence public policy as well. How, huddle for prizes and so on. These are part of, more or less would inform the plurality of knowledge. Policy entrepreneurs and brokers translate and contest meanings across hierarchical divides. And this is why we always, in our works, we always emphasize the role of policy entrepreneurs or the role of policy practitioners. Because as policy practitioners, we bridge the communication between the administrator and the public, or perhaps certain middleman in the government and that of an NGO worker. We bridge communication, we establish the spaces, we establish the room for conversation, and so on. And we always put emphasis that the way we establish the room, the way we establish the space will also influence the process of negotiating, the process of deliberating. Speaking truth to power is not absent in Asia. It takes different, often more constrained, but no less real forms, given hierarchical social structures. We cannot just simply we cannot just simply negotiate with people in power by saying certain narratives from the public or the everyday narratives of the public. Let's put it this way. People in Asia are very particular about evidences, about numbers and so on, right? So when we speak to power, they would always listen to legal and rational narratives, empirical evidences, and so on. And if you persuade them, they would somehow heed to your appeal or to your call. But when we talk to people down there to participate with alternatives that or to participate in thinking about alternatives or of the policy issues that is pressing in their locality, we do not just simply impose that okay, this is the statistical significance, the R square of this and that to them, but rather we communicate it from their own language as well, from the lay people's language. Why do they need to get involved into this project, or why do they need to get involved into planning certain scenarios and so on? And we might need to appeal in a more emotional aspect to them on why is it necessary for them to address these policy issues and why are their voices necessary to be involved. So policy styles matter, and how analysis is conducted and communicated determines its impact. The theory-practice divide is a false one here. The plurality of knowledge is Asian policy studies distinctive and under-theorized strength. Now, I'd like to move on to the last few slides for this presentation by introducing some of the emerging works of critical policy scholars here in Southeast Asia. This book is entitled Empathetic Policy Design, Emotional Engagement, Inclusive Spaces in Empowered Deliberation. Now, what Piapong is trying to put here is that emotions are not periphery to policy. They are constitutive of it, and the book argues that empathy must be built into the design process itself and not excluded in the design process. So when we design policy, we need to bring in emotions, we bring in empathy. Policy design is repositioned within the context of the Anthropocene, and public policy can no longer serve only technocratic ends, but must grapple with emotionally and ecologically charged conditions. Now, I have found out that, in this book of Piapong, he highlighted the role of hopes and fears in doing policy analysis and understanding the policy process. So, like, if I remember it correctly, short-term memory. The work of Piapong, he highlighted there that during the process of agenda setting, because in public policy there are different stages, right? In the agenda setting, in order for us to identify the problem, we need to ask the people and let them deliberate which part of the city do they feel hopeful, or which part of the city do they feel like fearful. So in fearful part, they have like categories to point, put like stickers and so on. It's more an interactive kind of problem framing and problem identification. And you can see the hot spots for hopes and for fears, where the people try to stick some notes and so on, and deliberatively engage in conversation. So the whole City Lab Innovation Lab project that was embedded in this book, Empathetic Policy Design, undergo different stages of process, coming from policy agenda setting, formulation, deliberative polling. You need to involve the citizens to vote for policy solutions or alternatives to certain issues. Okay. Empowering disadvantaged group to raise their voices through deliberation is treated as a core design requirement, and the book's ultimately aim is transformative, empathetic policy design as a pathway for moving weakly democratic and hierarchical systems towards a more or mature democratic governance. The second one is here, the policy analysis and high inequalities in Asia, from a critical and pragmatic perspective. What we did here is basically pointing on the role of narratives, deliberative spaces, and power in doing policy analysis in the context of inequalities. But it's not really a linear one, because we have pointed out that narratives takes different forms as well. There are logical rational narratives where we use logics, we use empirical evidences, legal language. There's also this argumentative narratives or ideological narratives or normative narratives. No, that's the proper term, normative narratives, where we use ideologies, where ideologies are embedded, and then the emotional narratives, just like connected to Pia Pong's work, where we use hopeful narratives, powerful or fearful narratives to understand policy issues. And the second one is on deliberative spaces. The deliberative spaces is not only a single space where we make the people interact. There are formal and semi-formal as well as informal spaces. We have classified a persuasive space where we put logical and rational narratives, empirics, when we speak to power, to the mayor, to the governor, or to those people in the National Innovation Agency. We also use a negotiative space to speak with civil society. We wanted to show certain ideology, normative narratives to persuade them why do they need to get involved in the policy process. And empowering narratives in a highly informal space, in empowering space, to involve people why their voices are necessary to get involved in the policy process. Now, the critical and pragmatic logic here is embedded as a call for a more practical solutions, however, critical where we think of the public at the center of addressing policy issues, to be embedded in crisis situations, for example. What we proposed here is mainly an epistemic emancipation that integrates Asian context sensitivity, challenging dominant frameworks that fail to account for the region's political complexity and social diversity. And we also illustrated here real-world cases and illustration examining inclusive participation and its transformative potential across Asian settings. And the critical pragmatic positioning in the policy analysis is both intellectually rigorous and practically actionable. And the last one is on cultivating policy innovations in hierarchical societies. Most scholarship on policy innovation focus on Western democracies, and this book fills the gap by examining how innovation happens in hierarchical and semi-autocratic Asian contexts. This book centers on policy innovation, cultivators, actors who work within centralized system to foster change despite structural constraint. And using Thailand as a case, it shows that innovation can emerge at the subnational level, as I have argued earlier, that subnational or the local level. And cultural cultivators develop context-specific tactics to navigate hierarchy. And the tactics that differ significantly from what Western policy entrepreneurship literature describes. And the core argument here is that context or political context, administrative system, and social-cultural setting fundamentally shape what policy innovation tools, policy innovation looks like. A genuinely global understanding requires moving beyond Western frameworks. Now, some concluding points is that perhaps we just appreciated some alternatives, the hybridity of doing things in the Asian context. In Asia, where technocracy runs deep and structural inequalities persist, complex policy problems cannot be solved by technical fixes alone, and they require approaches that go beyond what is simply observable and measurable. The practitioner here must actively engage diverse forms of knowledge, local, experiential, community-based, alongside expert knowledge, and when this makes the policy process messier and less certain, even so. A critical reflexive stance is a practical necessity, and this is where I position personally that It's not just enough to be critical at all times, but we need practical solutions as well. But we don't need to forget where these practical solutions are. We get the inspiration from. Practitioners need to consistently ask who defines the problem, whose knowledge counts, and who bears the cost of policy decisions. Sometimes the critical and pragmatic logic would always push us to think of practical solution, not just because we need to do things practically, but because we run out of resources. For example, we go to, well, Bangkok is a very big city, mega city, right? But if you go to the grid and to the far-flung areas, you can really see that, oh, this is different side of Thailand, Thailand that we did not see all the every day. So we appreciate that, despite the lack of resources, there's still a need to make practical alternatives to whatever policy issues that they, or public problems they are concerned of. In a context where democratic spaces is constrained, practitioners can work through deliberative openings to surface marginalized voices and contest dominant policy narratives. And this is where I think is an important lesson or key takeaway for practitioners working in highly unequal contexts. Because it needs certain level of creativity, certain level of compromise. I don't want to say that word, but sometimes we need to compromise in that sense um, to address certain problems and to surface marginalized voices and contest dominant policy narratives. We do not want the state to dominate the policy narratives that they want us to do. We also need people or the public to participate in the narratives or in policy making or in governance in general. Critical policy inquiry in Asia is not a finished project. It is a call for practitioners and scholars alike to build context-sensitive framework that are honest about power, inequality, and the limits of technocratic governance. So I think that ends my discussion, and thank you so much for your time and listening to my presentation.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that, Dr. John. Indeed, a lot. Even that was actually a lot to unpack. You really discussed the whole, a very, a, a very comprehensive history of critical policy studies, drawing from it as an onto epistemological critique to policy sciences. So thank you so much, Dr. John. And I do believe we may have some thoughts or questions from uh, from those who are participating in person and online. But maybe perhaps to start off with some questions, I think I'll start. So okay, Dr. Chan. So, on doing policy otherwise, so in your talk and in your work, you discuss and share how critical policy studies as an epistemological challenge to policy science has since built an expanding epistemic community with recent deepening engagements in Asia. And you've also discussed how policy studies in Asia inherited a positivist and technocratic frame from the West. So, for scholars and practitioners who are trained largely in that tradition, what do you think does a critical turn, or what do you think does critical policy studies ask us to unlearn? And then, what changes about how we would approach a policy problem when we do policy otherwise? So yeah, maybe just yeah. I'm not sure if you caught that from me. Yeah. So
We talk about it over breakfast. uh, yeah, so I think you're referring to how or what influences what influences career policy studies has brought to Asia, right? And what turns or can you please state it again? Like the last.
what changes about how we would approach a policy problem when we do policy otherwise? Like you mentioned, right, that when we the technocratic and rationalist frame inherited from the policy sciences would render a policy problem as something that is controllable, something that is fixed, something that is uh, that's something that can be resolved once you have the right data with you. Now, given the critical turn, how would we, what frames or would we, consider in defining a policy problem? What does critical policy studies tell us?
I think we will just perhaps this is like a practical advice,
Yeah.
considering the influence or how can we better operate critical policy studies in Asia, for example. Um, Critical policy studies, in my point of view, is not necessarily a substitute, or perhaps taking a dominant position as a substitute to technocratic policy analysis. But I would rather see it from a perspective of Deborah Stone, that when we think about numbers, numbers does not necessarily mean as an end in itself, but rather there are things to unpack. And by unpacking numbers, it needs certain perspectives or framing. So in the context of Asia, for example, context sensitivity really matters. And also, I would always argue that reflexivity, when we deal with policy issues or when we deal with certain situations, is a very important aspect. So, um, going back to your question, perhaps how do we can better operate critical policy studies practically in Asia would also demand certain reflexivity on our side, appreciation of the plurality of knowledge, and as well as we do not need to disregard practice in this context because um, practitioners in Asia has a lot of things to say and to unpack, particularly with the rich experience that they get from the field.
And just to continue with that, Dr. John. So I think that's where earlier you mentioned in your talk something about hybridity, right? Something about creating a form of hybridity between technocratic frames and those from critical policy studies. So maybe from your experience in Chiang Mai or in other policy workshops, how do you see this hybridity being operated in practice? Yeah, like because especially from those who are trained from this school of thought in the policy science, how like if we are to acknowledge the critical frame of doing policy otherwise, how does that look like? For example, in a town hall or in a village assembly where we deliberate policy. So how would that look like?
I think I'll bring in the case that I work with, the people there. Uh, Again, smart city planning is a highly technical activity. We need engineers, we need experts in doing so. But we go beyond the technical framing and rather entertain innovators, both social and technical innovators instead. So when we did the smart city planning, uh, quote unquote planning, we operated from a logic that we need to start from deliberation. But at the same time, in the process of doing policy, in the policy process or doing policy analysis, from problem identification to thinking about policy solutions or alternatives and the implementation and execution, we still open a window for technical analysis to come in, better reframe it as technical tools to come in. Like for example, in doing policy identification or problem identification, we use JS tools and so on to identify the geographical description or the geographical characteristics of the city or the town. But then again, we also need lay people's knowledge to supplement those JS output that they would say, oh, this is a danger zone, but the danger is something like this, it's being flooded and so on, regularly or yearly. There are also narratives from the people where you get like, oh, in the past 2 decades that I've been living here, or 4 decades that I've been living here, I've only noticed two major floods, something like that. So we need to appreciate those kinds of narratives as well and map it out in certain hazard zones and so on. I think that kind of hybridity better inform how we operate policy analysis or doing public policy in Asia. Because doing critical or embedding critical interpretive logic alone could also miss certain points such as like that. And also the technical tools and technical analysis would also complement or supplement deliberation or those outputs or those perspectives coming from interactions of the public. So yeah, innovation in itself is not necessarily technical. There are social innovations as well that we need to consider, and I think this is born out of the hybridity that how we design the policy process, where we design the policies.
Thank you. Yeah, we have. By the way, for those who are asking questions, please feel free to introduce yourself as well and your affiliation. Yes, Isabel.
Hi, I'm Isabel. I'm a MAIDS student. Thank you so much for your talk. Very interesting. And maybe we could stay just with the example that you were giving, but I'd like to learn more about um, Bosabong's, if I'm saying that right, Bosabong's kind of emphasis on the role of emotions and how like policies should be responsive to hopes and fears. Yeah, and if you could sort of elaborate more on what and how that kind of actually looks like on the ground.
Oh yeah. Um, just finding the right word. Well, the hopes and fears. I think he got one publication, a journal article for that one, like a crystallized version of the book. I think it was inspired from the publication. He developed it into a book. But I hope I can give justice to this word. Try to explain. The hopes and fears was operated primarily to identify pain points in the city, like which are the hopeful side, which are the fearful side. So if I can remember it correctly, they have this different kinds of stickers that shows different kinds of hopes and different kinds of stickers to show different kinds of fears. So like there are fears for like threat towards like safety, there are fears towards environment, degradation, flooding, other things. So what they did is mainly establish this kind of deliberative, um, deliberation can come in different kinds of forms, like post-its and so on, and stickers, and people get to interact. So try to put it in different spaces for 6 months or so, 3 months. And that's where they gather perspective, perspective how people would perceive and how Chiang Mai City would look like, different kinds of hosts. And then they try to synthesize what they get from the interactive kind of exhibition. Apart from the stickers, they also photo talk, something like that. They establish different photos and they let people who visit like interact with the photos, and share their emotions, share their sentiments about what they saw. And then apart from the photo talk, they also involve in deliberative forum where they use different personas. So they establish or they prepared certain personas. So this is vendors, like the stories and so on. This is a this is a um, homeless person with this kind of story. So they try to establish these personas and try to get the reception of the public and how what they feel. And then basically they collated all those observations and that will inform certain policy issues, pressing policy issues. And during the forums, you also get to have unexpected visitors, like the homeless person just get to read certain posts and just decided to join the forum and grab the spotlight and I'm just here to say something. I don't want you to pity on me, blah blah blah, and so on. So these are part of the stories within the book where Leopold told about that when we establish and my personal take on that when we establish these kinds of spaces, we get to really record the genuine reception of the public. So in more kind of a deliberative space, we do not only limit ourselves in a highly or linear idea or the basic idea of deliberative space. And my take is we need to establish a certain group that would accommodate empathy, that would accommodate emotions, that would accommodate certain uncertainties and so on. There are spaces for discussions and deliberations that accommodates empirical evidences, highly technical talks. People get to be, strong narratives over things and highly scientific kinds of narratives over things. So all of these are kind of messy, but in Piapong's work, he really traced very cleanly how emotions, how empathy would influence different stages of policy analysis. So what I mentioned earlier is just the first stage. But on the other stages, like for example, in formulation already, we think about alternatives to these issues that they got from the hopes and fears. They try to map it out from a layered kind of analysis, if you're familiar, causal layered analysis. I think Nock was yeah. Nock trying to I think she discussed about the causal layered analysis. But then again, the causal layered analysis was not only limited to a general, a bigger overview of causal analysis, but rather the different personas, the one that they use, they try to analyze and understand, oh, if this is a homeless person and so on, what does it feel about? What are the layers, the worldview, and all of that. So, and even up until the policy implementation, when we legitimize the alternatives that we can think of, they even get to involve NGO workers because the question of implementation is always sustainability. How can we sustainably implement something? So they engage NGO workers, they engage decision makers and those bureaucrats in the government and engage in a very kind of empathetic and emotional talk. Like, where can we get your commitment? As a policy designer, you really need to navigate all of these kinds of threads, like getting the strong commitment, ensuring that there is sustainability when you implement things, where there is follow up and so on. So a month ago, maybe April, we went to that urban agricultural center, and it's still working. It's still there because they were able to get the certain group of people or sector to get or to gain the kind of ownership that we own this and we are enabler of this kind of project. We are the main stakeholder of this project, so we own this. So I think I hope I gave justice to his work. But these are some of the points that we might overlook because we are so focused with the technological solutionism that the very simple dynamics, microdynamics, the process of doing policy analysis are emotion heavy. There are emotionality that is involved in the process.
Hi, I'm Tiana from MAIDS. So just on that point about design policy for sustainability, I I visited a town that had started a smart city initiative and they had the agriculture center and there's a sufficiency economy center. And when I went there, they were all closed down and it had only been 4 years. So I wonder, when you're designing policy, how much is that built into the design? Are they going to keep up with this? Is this something for the long term?
Yeah, I think it's the usual pain point for development workers and policy practitioners. I think all of our work intersect with each other. The development studies and policy work really intersect with each other. Um, there's always, I think, a heavy responsibility to how we design things. And design in itself does not necessarily mean technical design, but rather how we can navigate the social structures of things, how we can navigate the social dynamics and so on. Perhaps in these kinds of projects, perhaps sometimes these are, I don't want to say this, but symbolic stuff. There are initiatives that are so symbolic or because of certain political you know, spur of the moment. Thing. Yeah. So this sometimes happen, and we also take note of that because there are also discussions about symbolic policy, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Uh, so sustainability of projects would always depend, perhaps, on how we design it, and I would rather argue that that's the role of the deliberative practitioner or the policy practitioner, perhaps. That in a way, you don't necessarily need to be out there and be a diva or own everything. But at the very least, there is this point earlier in this scholar's work that you're an active participant of the process as well. So take it or leave it, you're also part of the design process, you're also part of the implementation process. And perhaps you have also this kind of moral responsibility to keep hold of the sustainability of certain policy project. So the question of the genuine intention sometimes is a very important question to ask when we think about development initiatives towards communities, for example. So yeah,
I think maybe sometimes there's a disconnect between the public administration and the policymakers. Maybe not everywhere, but in Thailand, maybe.
mm, um, yeah, I think especially when we think of the central, the higher one, the national government, there's some sort of the disconnect because of the high centrality that the government is trying to, the government positions itself here in a very highly centralized kind of setup. But then again, there are like chases or perhaps stories where local governments can really be empowered to work on sustainable efforts.
And I agree, when you have a deliberative process and you bring people in to that initial process, they're more likely to help you sustain the project afterwards. But when it's top down, maybe people are less inclined to buy in after the fact.
Yeah, for me, the deliberative process as well, I find it a little bit, I don't know, messy and a little bit difficult to like roll out in the national scale. Not a believer of mini publics. I don't know, but yeah, the mini publics are just more or less they are elites as well who were chosen to be part of a certain deliberative process. But then again, I think for me, my perspective on that is that genuine deliberation really exists when you get involved different people from different walks at the local level. I think at the very least I can attest to that one, even though it's messy.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Gabby from MAIDS also and also from the Philippines. And I really resonated when you critique the Western origins of critical policy studies. And especially in Asia and increasingly in Southeast Asia, there's increasing precarity and increasing authoritarianism. And I wonder how does critical policy studies manifest in those kinds of situations. So how does the deliberative process work? How does involving all stakeholders from all walks of life work? Because in those kinds of contexts it's hard to operationalize the implementation of critical policy studies.
Yeah, I think I'll speak for the case in Thailand because it's much more familiar to me, even though for the Philippines. But yeah, uh, the manifestation of over authoritarian contexts, or perhaps weak democracies, is really valid. Like Thailand operates in a different kind of government system, and democratic institutions are a little bit weak at some point. Uh, and the centrality also takes another layer of it. The Thai centrality, the centralized kind of government takes another layer in this kind of precarious situation, precarious moment. How does critical policy studies manifest in these kinds of contexts? Perhaps that's a very important. I would also say an interesting point to reflect on because when we look into the deliberative policy analysis process. And we also refer to the realities on the ground. It is always the local chief executive who always make the decision, or a politician or decision maker, policy maker, always the final call to implement something. And this is also my dilemma as well, who's also working on deliberative or studying deliberative policy analysis. Because at the end of the day, it's not on our role to make decisions. It is with the government, it's with the politicians, or perhaps policymakers. The only thing or the only caveat that can make decisions if the funding is coming from a government organization or if it's a grant or so, then we can make decisions on that. But at the very least, if it's like big policy issues and needs the decisions of the policymaker, then it needs to be the decision maker on the ground who makes the decision. So it's more or less my kind of dilemma as well in highly centralized or weak democratic context. Because at the end of the day, the politicians would always have their own political interests at some point over certain policy decisions or innovation or how do they address policy problems. But at the very least, I would say we might go back to the very principle of why this critical perspective would rather exist. Because it also put certain weight to the shoulders of policy practitioners as they advocate to address these policy issues and to actively participate in democratic discussions, democratic participation of over understanding these policy issues. Uh, Perhaps I would put my hope on that part. It's a little bit difficult. We put our hope to really have these policy practitioners um, realize what the principles are, what the characteristics of a real policy practitioners are, who influences decisions, perhaps involved in an active political engagement.
If there are no questions online, I don't believe there are. But if you can raise your hand, you can also raise your hand. But actually, I have in line with that, no, in the context of Asia, for example, in your past work, I believe, and I think in one of the chapters that you showed there in online, the imperative of having critical policy studies as being an urgent uh, scholarship in Asia is that it's really because of this context of Asia being authoritarian, where there is post-truth politics and where there are illiberal democracies, for example, there's an illiberal context. But from a structural point of view, these conditions are the conditions that corrode or constrain deliberation, especially at the central level and even in some context at the local level, because of the persona of the local chief executive, for example, or your mayor or your yeah. So these local elites, for example, and uh, the deliberation from what you said, I see that it assumes a plurality of policy knowledge, right? Evidence, where we also see evidence that settles dispute and fosters shared understanding and good faith. When in a post-truth context where truth itself is contested therein, how do you deliberate with actors or people who don't even want the deliberation to succeed or who don't want the conversation to succeed? Like how do you come at a shared understanding or a shared understanding of what the problem is in a post-truth context? Yeah, I think something along those lines.
Very interesting, difficult question. Um, well, there are attempts from critical policy scholars to tackle post-truth, and perhaps there are attempts as well from technocrat or positivist empiricist scholars to refer post-truth to critical scholars. They were saying like, oh, it's because of you, critical scholars, that's why we have post-truth at the moment. Um, but this was answered by Frank Fisher in his book Critical Policy, that it is not good to refer post-truth as works of the critical scholarship or the interpretive scholars, but rather it is a high time for interpretive scholars to understand the social constructions and so on, and to deeply understand where and why are these post-truth narratives are coming. Where are they coming? Why are they? Um, why we have these kinds of post-truth narratives on our table at the moment, and how do we deal with that? And Fisher utterly described that it is coming from the interpretive. It should be coming from the interpretive side to really deeply understand, because we are capable of um, looking into the deep reasons and the deep reality, the in its deepest sense, how or what are these post-truth narratives are about. Now, I think that's where we need to start the conversation about post-truth. The post-truth that Frank was trying to position is mainly on climate change denials and environmental challenges, climate change as an environmental challenge. That's what Frank has been working on for quite some time. And how do we actively perhaps face this contentions coming from climate denials and deniers and so, and even Trump as well. Uh, so, um, with regards to the deliberative policy analysis, how do we engage with this post-truth peddlers? I think it's something that we need to further look into, and perhaps to this is very contentious in the case of Philippines, for example, or perhaps in Southeast Asia in general, where public is easy made to believe with the post-truth narratives that is found online, and even in politics or even Facebook, Meta, in social media, they really influence the public what to see and what to believe in. Now, I think the burden right now is not really for the deliberative policy analysis, but rather the burden is on the interpretive scholarship. How can we navigate and understand deeply this kind of situation or this kind of pressing issue of post-truth narratives? By then, if we get to understand and get to provide a holistic perspective on the post-truth narratives coming from interpretive standpoint, social construction, and so on, then therefore it will inform how we can navigate deliberation.
Yeah, there's a sharing online if you'd like to.
I'll read it. In the Philippines, you need to appease the local chief executives. They don't like being questioned, and they will counter the counter narratives. One needs patience for this. If policies or problems would be reframed, too needs some will from these decision makers and acknowledgement that something is wrong. So the question is,
Um, I think it's a discussion point. So
Oh,
maybe
okay.
you'd like to react or yeah, maybe 2 minutes.
yeah, I have a weird response.
Go.
Yeah, that's why addressing policy issues and speaking truth to power does not necessarily mean that we need to follow certain framework or a square framing, a linear perspective. I would say that it would always, and also very important to understand that narratives also take different forms. There are different kinds of narratives, and also we need to be very careful to choose what kind of narrative we bring into the table in discussion with local chief executives. Perhaps the local chief executives, the dynamics within his or her office is also something that we need to consider as well. Sometimes it's not just the local chief executive who gives or makes the decision, but rather there are advisors within the office that also informs the local chief executive of what decision to make. As I have mentioned in the book, Policy Analysis and High Inequalities, there's always a need for a room or for a space to be established persuasive and a formal space where we tend to persuade through logical, empirical, statistical, whatever narratives, the local chief executive, give them the reason why it's necessary to look into these policy issues. So in that sense, I do not necessarily dismiss the technical rational narratives or technical perspective because in understanding context sensitivity, such as the question here or the position here, it's the contextual reality. There are certain policy actors or political actors who would really take that hold towards technical or rational kind of narratives or evidences. And we need to also provide it. So that's my take on that one. Like it's it's very tricky to navigate the process of persuading local chief executives. But there's also a need that we position certain valid or perhaps what they think is valid or empirical narratives that would support what we wanted to try to advocate to those policy makers.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. John. So, yeah, I think that thank you so much for your time and for engaging with our questions and discussion points here in person and online. If you do have any more questions or conversations that you'd like to have, please feel free to contact Dr. John. I think you could even ask for his email address if you want to. Yeah, it's there. It's mesacramento at up.edu.ph. So yeah, so thank you so much for joining us in this the third session of our MAIDS-GRID Expert Research Seminar Series. I do believe that there are more sessions to come. This is our third and I think our first face-to-face session. The past two talks have been delivered purely online. So we look forward to future conversations perhaps with the incoming batches of students from our Meets and Grades programs. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. John. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you so much for your time. And for our participants online, thank you so much for coming with us. So I maybe yeah, so I'll now end the Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us. And maybe for those who are participating online, we could have a quick photo opportunity as well. Or maybe those who are on Zoom would like to turn on their cameras. I will not. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. My apologies. I think you would have technical difficulties if we're going to flash everyone's faces online. So thank you so much for joining us to our participants on Zoom. Thank you.